How did a millennial empire, master of the Nile and the pyramids, collapse? Welcome to Collapse, where giants fall. Today, we follow the traces of a fascinating mystery, the fall of ancient Egypt. How could such a powerful civilization disappear? Wars, invasions, political intrigues, economic decline. The causes intertwine in a fascinating mystery. Between the glory of the Rameses and the shadow of the Ptolemies, history reveals the warning signs of an inevitable fall. But before we embark on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing. Thank you and enjoy the journey. At the beginning of every great civilization, there is always a close link between the natural environment and the social organization that follows. In the case of ancient Egypt, this key environment is undeniably the Nile. As a long river traversing a vast desert territory, it played a foundational role in the culture and history of the Egyptian people, from the first agricultural communities to the early royal dynasties. If you look at a map of Northeast Africa, you'll immediately notice a long, fertile corridor traversing the arid zones, the Nile Valley. The river travels great distances from the heart of Africa before emptying into the Mediterranean Sea through a vast delta. The ancient Egyptians called their country Kemet, meaning the Black Land, referring to the dark color of the soil left by annual floods. In contrast, the surrounding desert lands were called Deshret, the Red Land. This antagonism between the wet, fertile banks of the Nile and the vast desert nurtured the religious imagination and social structuring of Egypt. Each year, around July until October, the level of the Nile rose considerably. The neighboring lands, flooded, benefited from a significant deposit of silt, a mix of fertile particles washed down from the upstream soils. This layer of silt enriched the fields and allowed farmers to harvest abundant crops once the water receded. The annual floods were predictable enough to enable a cyclical agricultural organization. The ancient Egyptian year was generally divided into 3 seasons. The flood period, Akhet, marked the arrival of the waters. Next came the germination or sowing season, Pere, during which time crops were planted and tended. Finally, the harvest season, Shemu, closed the cycle by allowing produce to be gathered. This regularity had a stabilizing effect on society. The assurance of food supplies encouraged population growth and strengthened the authority of the central leadership responsible for distributing and overseeing these resources. In addition to its agricultural role, the Nile played an essential role in both domestic and foreign trade. Boats could travel up or down the river, transporting raw materials, food, construction stones, and even later, wealth intended for export. The pharaohs, by controlling the waterways, ensured the political and economic domination of the country. This role as a facilitator of internal exchanges united the Nile Valley, from the south, Upper Egypt, to the north, Lower Egypt, including the Delta. This resulted in a collective awareness of the importance of the royal institution in managing hydraulic works, such as maintaining canals and regulating irrigation, and protecting against potential invaders attracted by the prosperity of the arable lands. The Nile offered a linear communication route, connecting the communities that developed along its banks. Nevertheless, its course was divided into 2 major regions, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. Upper Egypt consisted of a narrow strip of fertile land framed by rocky cliffs, while Lower Egypt widened into a fan shape, forming the delta, often swampy, but extremely rich in silt. Legend has it that Narmer, sometimes identified with King Menes, managed around 3100 before Christ to impose his authority over the entire territory, thus laying the foundations for a unified monarchy. According to this tradition, he then wore a double crown called the Shent, symbol of the fusion of the two Egypts. Although the exact dimension of this historical act remains subject to debate, it is certain that the idea of a joint management of the river, its floods, and the agricultural needs is at the heart of the constitution of the Egyptian state. Beyond geography, Egypt was also built around a complex religious imagination, composed of cosmogonic myths and an extremely varied pantheon. The Egyptians of antiquity lived in a universe imbued with deities associated with both natural forces, flood, fertility, the sun, and moral values such as justice or cosmic order. The most familiar manifestations of this polytheism included gods such as Ra, Amun, Isis, Osiris, Seth, or Horus, whose fame today extends well beyond the Mediterranean basin. The Egyptian pantheon was characterized by syncretism and adaptability. Gods could be represented in human form, animal form, or as a combination of both, reflecting a specific divine trait. Thus, Anubis was often depicted with a jackal head, symbol of the desert and necropolises, while Horus, mythical son of Osiris and Isis, bore a falcon head. For the Egyptians, these representations were not mere metaphors. They expressed the deep and multiple nature of the deity, uniting the world of men, when the god appeared in human form, and that of the fauna linked to the Nile or the desert animal heads. The cults in honor of these deities varied from one region to another, as each major city had its tutelary god. Thebes, for example, particularly venerated Amun, while Heliopolis, near the delta, dedicated a cult to Ra, the solar god. Among the many legends woven over time, the myth of Osiris holds a considerable place. In this story, Osiris, legitimate and benevolent king, was murdered through the trickery of his envious brother Seth. Isis, the wife of Osiris, used her magical powers to resurrect her deceased husband and allow him to reign over the world of the dead. Their son Horus, born of this posthumous union, stood against Seth to avenge his father and reclaim the earthly throne. This dramatic plot was not just an epic tale. It established the foundations of sacred kingship, in which the reigning pharaoh was considered the incarnation of Horus, while the deceased pharaoh became a new Osiris. From this myth emerged two major elements of Egyptian civilization. First, the importance of the funerary cult and embalming. The Egyptians saw death as a transition to another form of existence, for which the body had to be preserved and rituals performed to ensure the survival of the soul. Tombs, sarcophagi, magical formulas inscribed in the Book of the Dead were intended to ease the passage of the deceased to the tribunal of Osiris. Secondly, the myth of Osiris served as the ideological foundation for the pharaonic institution. The sovereign, guarantor of order, enjoyed divine legitimacy, rooted in the symbolic lineage with Horus and Osiris. At the heart of Egyptian religion and thought, there was a major concept, Maat, personified in the form of a goddess often depicted with a feather on her head. Maat embodied cosmic order, balance, and justice, everything that ensures the harmony of the universe. A virtuous pharaoh was responsible for maintaining and defending Maat, both spiritually and politically or socially. In this view, laws and religious rites intertwined to promote stability. As soon as a famine, epidemic, or foreign invasion occurred, the population saw this as a disturbance of Maat, suggesting that the ruler was no longer in alignment with the will of the gods. This moral and sacred dimension of power placed a great responsibility on the king. If he failed in his task, the entire universal order was threatened. The importance of Ma'at was also reflected in daily life and personal morality. Scribes and officials, for example, were expected to render justice by respecting the truth, without favoritism, to avoid disrupting the divine balance. Many Egyptian wisdom texts, often in the form of maxims or instructions, outlined principles of conduct aimed at living in accordance with Ma'at. Moreover, during the judgment of the soul in the afterlife, the heart of the deceased was weighed by Anubis and Thoth on the scale, compared with the feather of Ma'at. A heart too heavy with sins condemned the individual to annihilation. This symbolic ritual illustrates how the notion of order and justice transcended earthly life and guided all aspects of Egyptian thought. Once the natural and religious setting was established, one must consider the historical context that saw the emergence of the world's first monarchy. The progressive unification of the Nile Valley did not happen overnight. It was the result of several millennia of demographic, technological, and cultural evolution, eventually granting the Egyptians the ability to organize into a centralized and enduring state. Long before pyramids and great cities, the first agricultural communities settled in the Nile region as early as the Neolithic period, probably attracted by the security provided by the river's waters and the fertility of the soils. These initially dispersed groups began to settle down, cultivate grains, such as barley and wheat, and raise animals, cattle, sheep, goats. Consequently, they developed new skills: pottery to store food, weaving to make clothing, rudimentary goldsmithing to make jewelry and prestige objects. This long phase of agricultural expansion is known as the pre-dynastic period. As the population grew, the emergence of local chiefdoms was observed, each possessing its emblem or totem. For instance, the falcon, symbolizing a dominant clan, or the bee and reed that would later appear on royal representations. Several cultures are distinguished based on regions of the Nile Valley, and differences in pottery and funerary artifacts. For example, the culture of Badari, or that of Nakata, in Upper Egypt, have left characteristic remains that demonstrate the increasing sophistication of these societies. In parallel, the first rudimentary hieroglyphs seem frequently to appear on pottery or stone palettes, indicating a progressive development of writing, an essential tool for administering a state. It was during this period that social inequalities gradually increased. Warrior or religious leaders began to distinguish themselves by accumulating wealth, often in the form of material goods, land, and labor. The more elaborate tombs, sometimes containing imported prestige objects, reflect the emergence of an elite capable of controlling production, trade, and access to critical resources, water, agriculture, etc. This phenomenon was reinforced by the expansion of trade networks towards Nubia, to the south, the Levant to the east, and possibly the Red Sea. The rise of specialized craftsmanship, increased mastery of metallurgy, initially copper, and improved navigation techniques on the Nile contributed to this dynamism. Towards the end of the 4th millennium before Christ, the chiefdoms of Upper Egypt gradually gained the upper hand over their counterparts in the Delta, thereby uniting the two parts of the country. The ancient Egyptians often attributed this fact to a single king, Narmer, whose tomb is said to have been located in the ancient city of Tinis, not far from Abydos. Later, historiographical tradition, including the priest Manetho in the 3rd century before Christ, sometimes confused Narmer with Menes, the first pharaoh documented as the founder of the first dynasty. Today, archaeologists still debate, are Narmer and Menes two names for the same person or two distinct rulers? In any case, the famous Narmer palette, an iconographic document discovered at Hierakonpolis, very explicitly illustrates the idea of a victory of the king of Upper Egypt over the north, symbolizing unification. The act of unification was not purely military. Historical sources suggest there was a genuine collective need to jointly manage the river, its floods, and the distribution of arable lands. The gradual centralization of power responded to a logistical imperative, coordinating irrigation works, harmonizing taxation, and developing common resources. The founders of the Egyptian state relied on a royal ideology in which the sovereign was not simply a political leader, but a living god, guaranteeing by his mere presence the maintenance of Ma'at and, therefore, the proper unfolding of annual floods. With the establishment of the first dynasty, around 3100 before Christ, the birth of a centralized administration took place. Scribes, key figures in the social hierarchy, had the primary task of recording agricultural resources, collecting taxes, managing granaries, and organizing public corvées, notably for digging or maintaining canals. The emergence of a capital, sometimes identified with Thanis at the beginnings, but more surely located at Memphis thereafter, marked a turning point. Memphis, strategically situated at the border between Upper and Lower Egypt, became the seat of the royal bureaucracy and the nerve center of the emerging kingdom. Early on, the cult around the royal person was structured. The pharaoh, considered the earthly manifestation of Horus, held a sacred status that clearly differentiated him from the rest of the population. The rites, offerings, and monumental constructions, palaces, temples, steles, served both to assert the king's authority and to remind the gods of the necessity of maintaining the country's prosperity. This alchemy between the practical organization of society, management of irrigation, distribution of granaries, control of trade, and a religious legitimation resulted in an exceptionally stable political system, capable of enduring over time. While other civilizations underwent early collapses due to internal conflicts or climatic changes, Egypt managed to consolidate its unified structure and transmit a common cultural heritage for generations. The divine kingship, hieroglyphic writing, and administrative innovations would soon combine to give rise, during the following centuries, to what is known as the Old Kingdom, the period when the pyramids reached their apogee. But before reaching this point, the fundamental bases had already been laid: a unified territory by a river that nourished and bound the population, a mythological vision uniting the king's cosmic mission to the stability of the whole, and an embryonic bureaucratic apparatus capable of managing resources. In this journey, the first dynasty, and even the second that followed, remained essential in establishing the political and religious frameworks unique to Egypt. The funerary deposits, seals, inscriptions on the walls of funerary complexes in the Abydos or Saqqara regions, as well as the remains discovered by archaeologists, attest to the organized effort by the ruling class to standardize cult, fiscal, and administrative practices. The borders of Egypt, at least in its original valley, were defined, and an identity sentiment blossomed, reinforced by the belief in a common destiny under the aegis of the pharaoh. The Old Kingdom, which spans approximately from 2700 to 2200 before Christ, is often referred to as the Age of the Pyramids. This period sees the complete assertion of pharaonic authority and the establishment of institutions that will shape Egypt for centuries to come. The administrative capital of the Egyptian state, Memphis, occupies a strategic position at the point of contact between Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. In this way, the pharaoh, the supreme authority figure both religiously and politically, can easily oversee the entire country. This centralization of power is one of the fundamental traits of the Old Kingdom. It allows for the coordination of large community projects and ensures a certain internal stability as long as the sovereign maintains Ma'at, that is, the just order on earth. Among the dynasties marking the Old Kingdom, the third dynasty stands out for the reign of Djoser. He is a pharaoh whose legacy is partly linked to the famous step pyramid of Saqqara. Designed by the architect Imhotep, who will himself become a quasi-divine figure in later Egyptian tradition, this pyramid is considered the very first large-scale stone monument in the world. Initially conceived as a superimposed mastaba, a type of rectangular flat structure used since the beginnings of funerary architecture, it evolves to form a tiered edifice, culminating at more than 60 meters in height. Its purpose was not only an architectural feat, but also a way to consecrate the eternal rest of the pharaoh and manifest royal power in the landscape. This desire for grandeur echoes throughout the kingdom. Around the pyramid, a vast funerary complex is built, including courtyards, temples, and underground galleries. The enclosure surrounding the pyramid is adorned with decorations and reliefs, reflecting the religious importance of this project. It is a sacred space where the sovereign, even after his death, remains present to participate in the regeneration of nature and the stability of the country. Around 2600 before Christ, the fourth dynasty begins, synonymous with the zenith in pyramid construction. On the Giza plateau, near the future city of Cairo, rise the three pyramids that will fascinate the world to this day, those of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. It is primarily the Pyramid of Khufu, often called the Great Pyramid, that inspires admiration. With an initial height approaching 146 meters, it is about 138 meters today due to erosion and the removal of its outer casing. It remained the tallest structure ever built by man until the completion of the Eiffel Tower in the 19th century. To erect it, it is estimated that millions of limestone and granite blocks, each weighing several tons, had to be moved. It was long believed that the pyramids were erected by slaves. However, modern archaeological research reveals that many workers were actually peasants, mobilized during the Nile's flood season when they could not cultivate their land. They worked in exchange for food and sometimes specific compensations, participating in a great collective project justified by religion and the glory of the sovereign. The society of the Old Kingdom was profoundly hierarchical. At the top was the pharaoh, followed by the vizier and the royal entourage, then scribes, specialized craftsmen, notably stonecutters, goldsmiths, sculptors, and finally the mass of peasants. All contributed to the enhancement of the royal figure, as it was considered that the pharaoh, as the son of the gods, or divine incarnation, ensured the perpetual ma'at, and hence social harmony. From the 5th dynasty onwards, the balance begun under Djoser and continued by the builders of Giza begins to weaken. The clergy, particularly that of the cult of Ra in Heliopolis, a city located on the outskirts of modern Cairo, strengthens and gains more and more privileges. Lands previously subject to royal administration fall under the control of the temples, eroding the pharaoh's ability to easily levy taxes. Added to this are complex succession issues. Several rulers of the 6th dynasty are considered weak or too young, leaving a void at the head of an administration that was until then highly centralized. Parallel to this, emerging economic challenges arise. It is suspected that the floods of the Nile may have decreased, leading to a reduction in agricultural production. However, without sufficient harvests, the population suffers from shortages, and the wealth of the state diminishes. Large construction projects continue to consume enormous resources, while in the provinces, the nomarchs, that is, the governors of each nome or district, gain increasingly significant autonomy. Where pharaonic power reigned supreme a few decades earlier, it must now contend with local ambitions. This slow destabilization eventually leads to the collapse of central authority, marking the end of the Old Kingdom, and the transition to a phase of division, the First Intermediate Period. The First Intermediate Period is a stage of political fragmentation that extends roughly from 2200 to 2050 before Christ. Egypt breaks apart into several rival kingdoms, often dominated by local dynasties or powerful nomarchs. We have literary testimonies, such as the Lamentations of Ippur, describing the chaotic situation. These texts emphasize disorder, growing misery, and the destruction of established order. Social roles seem reversed. The rich become poor. The poor sometimes gain unexpected positions, and violence becomes widespread. The official religion, traditionally centered around the cult of the pharaoh and the celebration of unity, suffers from this disunity. Local cults, tied to regional deities, gain importance. Multiple centers of power emerge, sometimes linked to family lineages vying for control of resources. In the Nile Delta, to the north, someone might proclaim themselves as king, while another, often in Thebes or in the region of Asyut, to the south, also claims pharaonic legitimacy. Civil war and political fragmentation cause significant communication and transportation difficulties. The Nile remains navigable, but taxes, tolls imposed by different authorities, and endemic conflicts hinder commerce. Agriculture also suffers from the disorganization of the central state, which can no longer properly supervise the repair of irrigation canals. When the irrigation system is not maintained, water can stagnate or, conversely, be lacking in certain areas. Harvests decrease, worsening famine and the anger of local populations. During this period, some notable families seize titles previously reserved for the sovereign. This locally strengthens the power of these elites, who sometimes build their own monumental tombs, reflecting their desire to rival the glory once associated with the pharaoh. The royal authority, when it still exists, often appears cosmetic or limited to a few nomes. The kings who succeed one another fail to assert themselves over the entire territory, as the crisis seems deep. Around 2050 before Christ, Egypt gradually emerges from this era of turmoil, thanks to the unifying efforts of rulers from Thebes, a city located in Upper Egypt, about 700 kilometers south of the Nile Delta. The leader of the 11th dynasty, Mentuhotep II, manages to defeat the rival dynasties of the north, reunifying the country. He establishes and consolidates his capital in the Theban region, which remains an influential hub in political and religious life. The local deity, Amun, thus gains in importance until later merging with Ra, the solar god, under the name Amun-Ra. This divine fusion symbolizes the desire for reconciliation between the Heliopolitan tradition, cult of Ra, and Theban faith, cult of Amun. The term Middle Kingdom, 2050 to 1750 before Christ, qualifies an entire phase of cultural renaissance. The pharaohs of the 11th and 12th dynasties, notably Sesostris and Amenemhat, strive to consolidate the borders and encourage agricultural production. The Nile flood, having become more stable again, allows them to organize great hydraulic works. They also erect defense structures, such as fortresses along the Nile, to control trade routes and discourage foreign incursions. The Middle Kingdom is often considered the golden age of classical Egyptian literature. It is during this period that wisdom texts, moral instructions, tales, and even epic novels flourish. The instructions of Amenemhat, inherited from the reign of Pharaoh Amenemhat III, are a quintessential example. These are ethical, political, and practical recommendations intended for his successor. Simultaneously, love poetry, travel narratives, and pharaonic military exploits constitute a part of the literary production, revealing a cultured society concerned with formalizing its values. On the architectural front, there is an evolution compared to the Old Kingdom. The pyramids of the Middle Kingdom remain notable, but are less monumental than those of Giza, sometimes built with a core of mud bricks and a stone casing, giving them an imposing appearance. Funerary rites become more complex. The emphasis shifts a bit from the pyramid alone to include funerary enclosures, and sometimes more elaborate underground tombs. For example, the Pyramid of Amenemhat III at Hawara is famous for housing what the ancient Greeks would later call the labyrinth, a series of corridors and rooms whose configuration remains complex to interpret. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom also pursue a policy of expansion to the south, notably into Nubia, a territory covering present-day Sudan. This region houses significant gold mines and serves as a commercial hub between sub-Saharan Africa and the Nile Valley. Fortresses such as those of Semna or Buin are built to control navigation and protect Egyptian interests. The wealth in gold, ivory, and ebony from Nubia helps cement the power of the government of Thebes. To the east, the Levant route, the coastal region of the Near East, offers trade opportunities for wood, copper, resins, and various exotic products, all essential for shipbuilding and religious rituals. Transactions are often conducted via caravans or by sea, ensuring the Middle Kingdom a broader economic influence than during many earlier phases. However, after a flourishing period, the Middle Kingdom gradually declines under the 13th dynasty. Pharaohs struggle to maintain effective control over the entirety of Egypt. Lower Egypt becomes politically unstable again, while in the east, populations likely from Canaan or Syria-Palestine begin to settle in the delta. The Egyptians call them Hyksos, a term generally translated as chiefs of foreign lands. The precise reasons for their arrival are still debated. Some suggest a brutal invasion, others imply a gradual infiltration facilitated by internal weaknesses of the Egyptian regime. Regardless, the pressure from the Hyksos becomes more significant in the following phase, known as the Second Intermediate Period, which marks the end of the Middle Kingdom. Around 1750 before Christ, the Hyksos settled permanently in the northern part of Egypt and established their capital at Avaris. To legitimize their rule, they adopt certain Egyptian cultural codes, such as the pharaonic title or the use of hieroglyphic writing, while retaining several traditions from the Levant. For the Egyptians living in the south, especially in Thebes, this is seen as an usurpation. The legitimate monarchy remains, according to them, in the hands of pure Egyptian rulers, even if they no longer control the entire country. The presence of the Hyksos will at least have a notable technical impact. They likely introduced the use of the war chariot in Egypt, and according to some sources, the composite bow, weapons more sophisticated than those previously available to the Egyptian army. Instead of resulting in total disaster, this cultural shock prompts the Thebans to undertake a revamp of their military apparatus, thus preparing for the reconquest of the Delta. Although this period is often perceived as a time of trial for Egypt, it is not devoid of forms of creativity. For instance, there is a certain emulation in the arts, influenced both by local styles and those from Western Asia. The Thebans, to maintain a semblance of prestige, continue to erect temples for their gods, especially Ammon, and to honor their ancestors. Pharaohs such as Seqenenre-Tao and Kamose begin the struggle against the Hyksos, initiating the reconquest of the north. This conflict is not quick. It requires mobilizing resources and training seasoned soldiers. Subsequently, Ahmose, considered the founder of the 18th dynasty, crowns this effort by definitively expelling the Hyksos from the Delta, paving the way for the unification of the kingdom and the entry into the new kingdom. With Ahmose begins the 18th dynasty, one of the most prestigious in all pharaonic history. Having consolidated his power from Thebes, this sovereign manages to drive out the Hyksos, who had entrenched themselves in the delta. Egypt is unified once again, and only Nubia to the south still requires some campaigns to eliminate resistant strongholds. From then on, the pharaohs of the new kingdom strive to build a highly centralized and militarized state, capable of intervening beyond traditional borders. This political renaissance creates the framework for vast territorial expansion, bringing Egyptian influence to its zenith. The reign of Thutmose III, between 1479 and 1425, before Christ, symbolizes the peak of this expansion. An accomplished military leader, he launches a series of campaigns towards the Levant and subdues various city-states in Palestine and southern Syria. To the south, he increases the Egyptian presence in Nubia, extending dominion to the fourth cataract of the Nile. With each conquest, Egypt gains tributes and resources, gold, cattle, exotic raw materials, that further enhance its prosperity. Local elites, sometimes tolerated in their positions, must pledge allegiance to the pharaoh and offer hostages, ensuring a forced loyalty. Thanks to this system, Egypt becomes an international power, establishing diplomatic relations with other great states of the Near East, Mitanni, Babylon, Hatti. Exchanges of gifts, princesses, or know-how strengthen the royal position. In this context, the state equips itself with an effective administration, supported by a body of scribes accustomed to inventorying spoils, the men levied for the army, and the wealth of the temple. Before Thutmose III, the political scene of the New Kingdom is marked by the reign of Hatshepsut, half-sister and royal wife of the deceased pharaoh Thutmose II. She serves as regent for the young Thutmose III, then eventually proclaims herself pharaoh. Hatshepsut is remarkable in several ways. She has her image represented with masculine features, wearing the false beard and attributes of royalty, yet remains presented as the daughter of Ammon. Under her reign, the focus is on peace, diplomacy, and trade. A famous expedition to the land of Punt, likely located in the Horn of Africa, present-day Eritrea or Somalia, brings back incense, myrrh, ebony, and exotic animals. Hatshepsut builds a funerary temple of great elegance at Deir el-Bahari, directly opposite Thebes, at the foot of the cliffs. Its colonnades, successive terraces, and finely carved reliefs attest to refined art. This edifice will later inspire other monumental constructions, establishing the city of Thebes as one of the most prestigious religious centers in Egyptian history. Around 1353 before Christ, Pharaoh Amenhotep IV comes to the throne. He leads an unprecedented religious policy. He breaks with the traditional cult of Amun-Re to impose the near-exclusive veneration of Aten, the solar force depicted as a disk radiating its rays. Taking the name Akhenaten, he who is beneficial to Aten, he moves the capital to found the city of Akhetaten, known today as Amarna. The temples of Amun are closed, and the clergy of Thebes is marginalized. This radical change profoundly shocks the population, accustomed to a multiple pantheon. While Amarna art stands out for a more naturalistic and spontaneous style, the sculptures of Akhenaten and his family show elongated features. This policy causes an internal crisis. After Akhenaton's death, the young Tutankhamun restored the traditional cult, pressured by the powerful priests of Ammon and the military elite. He moved the capital to Memphis, then to Thebes. However, these upheavals left scars. The influence of the Amun clergy was strengthened by its restoration, while the monarchy, associated with Akhenaton's unpopular experience, saw its prestige slightly tarnished. At the end of the reigns of Tutankhamun I and Horemheb, power passed to the 19th dynasty with Ramses III, then Seti III. But it was Ramses II, around 1279 before Christ, who most embodied the pharaoh of the Ramesside period. He was an energetic builder, erecting temples throughout the kingdom, such as the Ramesseum in Thebes or the gigantic colossi of Abu Simbel in Nubia. His reign was also marked by the Battle of Kadesh, around 1274 before Christ, against the Hittites, one of the first large-scale international conflicts. Although Egyptian royal propaganda presented the battle as a triumph, it was more of a tactical stalemate, followed by a peace treaty that is one of the earliest known diplomatic agreements in history. During the 19th and 20th dynasties, Egypt continued to maintain commercial and diplomatic exchanges with the kingdoms of the Near East and the Mediterranean. The pharaohs devoted themselves as much to repairing ancient temples as to erecting new monuments. Despite everything, the weight of military expenses and the growing complexity of the administration weakened the state's solidity. Under Ramses III, around 1186, before Christ, Egypt managed to contain several waves of invasion by the Sea Peoples, groups coming from elsewhere in the Mediterranean. However, these repeated wars exhausted the royal finances, especially as phenomena of administrative corruption or mismanagement seem to have occurred. Around this time, the first labor strikes in history were discovered, clearly illustrating the dysfunctions of the state apparatus. Gradually, in Thebes, the Amun clergy gained so much power that it rivaled even the pharaoh's authority. Indeed, the high priests owned vast estates, received significant revenue, and managed a large staff. Their religious prestige was such that the sovereign could no longer easily impose his will. After the death of Ramses V, the last pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, the political fracture was such that a new phase of fragmentation, known as the Third Intermediate Period, began, marking the effective end of the new kingdom as a unified era of prosperity. Deir el-Medina is a small village located on the west bank of the Nile opposite Thebes. It housed the elite craftsmen responsible for carving and decorating the royal tombs in the famous Valley of the Kings, where the pharaohs of the new kingdom rest. These workers, sculptors, painters, stonecutters, etc., generally enjoyed a slightly higher status than the classic peasantry. They received monthly rations of cereals, meat, and even beer and other goods, allowing them to fully devote themselves to their task without having to worry about meeting their own food needs. Under the reign of Ramses III, the solidity of the state system began to crack. The kingdom's coffers ran dry, partly due to costly military campaigns and the maintenance of major cults. Several preserved papyri, such as the famous Turin papyrus, relate that at one point, the rations intended for the artisans of Deir el-Medina suffered an alarming delay. Deprived of food and unable to adequately support their families, the workers decided to stop working and gathered to express their discontent. This was the earliest documented labor strike in human history. The accounts indicate that the workers went to protest in front of the temples of Ramses III to demand their rations, a sign that they mastered certain forms of collective protest. After multiple negotiations, the authorities eventually found a temporary solution by distributing emergency provisions. However, the episode is telling. It demonstrates that the administration could no longer consistently meet its obligations, whether it was paying the army, feeding the artisans, or financing the immense decorative and monumental works related to the pharaoh's funerary cult. Around 1070 before Christ, following the death of Ramses II, the last great ruler of the 20th dynasty, Egypt found itself more divided than ever. The pharaohs of the new kingdom had extended their authority as far as Nubia, to the south, and towards the Levant, to the east, ensuring economic prosperity through spoils of war and tributes. However, internal problems, administrative corruption, economic crises, external military pressures, contributed to the gradual decay of the central state. The country was now unable to maintain unified power. Thus began the Third Intermediate Period, an era of nearly 4 centuries marked by the coexistence of several competing power centers. The first major sign of this fragmentation was the establishment of the 21st dynasty in Tanis, in the Delta region in the north of the country. This dynasty, controlling Lower Egypt, coexisted with the religious power of Thebes, located in the south. In Thebes, the high priest of Amun, a historically powerful religious function due to the prestige of the god Amun-Ra, acquired almost total independence. Although nominally subordinate to the pharaoh, the Theban clergy took advantage of the collapse of royal authority to take effective control of Upper Egypt. Administrative efficiency weakened, rivalries multiplied, and national unity, once upheld by the unique cult of the pharaoh, guarantor of Maat, cosmic balance, waned. Amidst this disorder arose new elites of Libyan origin. For generations, Libyan populations had settled on the western margins of the Egyptian delta. Former mercenaries or military leaders integrated into the administration. Some became influential enough to establish their own dynasty, the 22nd, often called the Libyan dynasty. Sheshonq I exemplified this rise to power. Around 945 before Christ, he imposed himself as pharaoh and sought to reunify the country. The Libyan pharaohs, aware of the strategic importance of the Levant, launched campaigns in Palestine. In some Eastern texts, there are mentions of battles led by these Egyptian rulers to consolidate an external reach. Nonetheless, despite occasional successes, military expeditions, restoration of order in certain areas, the 22nd dynasty failed to build lasting cohesion. While Sheshonq I claimed the title of pharaoh, other rival Libyan branches also assumed royal prerogatives in various regions. As a result, Egypt became fragmented into several entities, sometimes governed simultaneously by rulers all claiming the pharaonic throne. Other short-lived dynasties, such as the 23rd and 24th, emerged concurrently. This fragmentation further chipped away at central authority. To the south of Egypt, an unexpected force was rising, the kings of Napata, in Nubia, a region corresponding roughly to present-day northern Sudan. Nubia, also called Kush by the Egyptians, had long maintained close ties with the Nile Valley. Periodically under Egyptian domination during the New Kingdom, or independent at other times, this territory was rich in gold, cattle, and mineral resources. In the 8th century before Christ, observing Egypt's political weakness, the rulers of Napata decided to invade. Their campaign was successful as they managed to subdue Upper Egypt before extending their control to the delta. This marked the foundation of the 25th Kushite dynasty. During their reign between 747 and 656 before Christ, these black kings of Nubia initiated a form of Egyptian Renaissance. They considered themselves the legitimate heirs of the glorious pharaohs of the past and encouraged a return to the artistic and religious traditions of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Statues, reliefs, temples, and rituals regained a past style, celebrating Amun as the supreme tutelary god of unified Egypt. Pharaoh Pianki, followed by his successors like Shabaka and Taharka, erected vast temple complexes, restored various local cults, and enhanced the prestige of the monarchy. This revival might have restored Egypt to its distant powers, but a growing threat loomed in the east: Assyria. At that time, the Assyrian Empire, centered in Mesopotamia, region of present-day Iraq, was aggressively expanding. Under the reigns of Esarhaddon and then Ashurbanipal, Assyria exercised hegemony over the entire Near East. Around 671 before Christ, Pharaoh Taharka failed to repel the Assyrian army. Memphis, the ancient capital of the north, fell. The Kushite rulers were permanently driven out of Lower Egypt. The Assyrian troops then organized the administration of the Delta, installing local leaders loyal to Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. Eventually, Nubia retreated to the south, retaining only Upper Egypt for a time, before being ousted from there as well. Egypt became, in fact, a vassal state of Assyria, although the complex geography and local opposition prevented the conquerors from establishing complete control. In the wake of the Assyrian invasion, a new dynasty began its rise in the Delta, the 26th, known as Sate, because its rulers established their capital at Sais, a city in the western Delta. From 664 before Christ, a local prince, Samtik-Tifi, managed to establish himself as the main interlocutor of the Assyrians. He obtained a certain level of support to manage Egypt on behalf of the Mesopotamian Empire. This arrangement was double-edged. While it ensured the maintenance of a semblance of independence, it placed Samtik and his successors in a position of vassalage. Nevertheless, Samtik the Pharaoh and his descendants tried to restore the past splendor of the pharaonic institution. They gradually strengthened the Egyptian army, recruiting among other things Greek mercenaries, a major innovation in the country's military history. These mercenaries, sometimes from the Aegean cities, brought new combat techniques and settled in garrisons on the Mediterranean coast. In doing so, the 26th dynasty gradually managed to loosen the Assyrian grip. Soon, the internal collapse of Assyria itself, with the fall of Nineveh in 612 before Christ by the Babylonians and the Medes, opened up a wider field of maneuver for Egypt. The Sate kings restored archaic-inspired ceremonies, reissued religious and administrative texts, and even attempted to reclaim the prestigious legacy of the great builders. This period is referred to as an archazing trend. Art, hieroglyphic writing, and statuary drew inspiration from the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom to emphasize a return to pharaonic roots. Under pharaohs like Necho II, Samtik II, and Apries, between 610 and 570 before Christ, Egypt seemed to regain a surge of power. Necho II, for example, financed the construction of a maritime fleet in the Mediterranean and a river fleet on the Nile, concerned with protecting his trade routes and territories. He also commissioned the excavation of a canal linking the Ptolemaic branch of the Nile to the Red Sea, somewhat foreshadowing the idea of a passage between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. The Sate kings established close contacts with Greek cities, such as Miletus or Corinth, granting some Greek communities the right to settle at Naucratis, an important port in the Delta, thereby facilitating economic and cultural exchanges. However, to the east, a new colossus emerged, the Achaemenid Persia. From the reign of Cyrus II, the Persian kingdom rapidly expanded, encompassing Lydia in Asia Minor, Babylon, and soon Phoenicia. The Sate Egypt, isolated diplomatically, was the next logical target for this expansion. After some preliminary skirmishes, the Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt in 525 before Christ by crossing the Sinai. At the Battle of Pelusium, the Egyptian army, led by Pharaoh Psamtik III, suffered a heavy defeat. Memphis was conquered, and the country fell to the Persians, becoming a province of the Achaemenid Empire. Now a Persian province. The governors appointed by the great king, first Cambyses II, then Darius I and their successors, strove to control Egypt while respecting a relative religious autonomy. The Persians knew that the success of their rule partly depended on their ability to accommodate the local elites. Therefore, they allowed the traditional Egyptian cults to persist, sometimes supported the restoration of temples to appease the priests, and maintained a fiscal system inherited from the 26th dynasty. Despite this, the memory of independence remained vivid, and there were sporadic uprisings against the occupiers. Thus, resistances formed in Upper Egypt or in the Western Delta, although they failed to rally the entire population into a general revolt. The Persians used Egypt as a strategic base for their campaigns in the Nile Valley or towards Libya. The country's natural resources, grain, gold, linen, were integrated into the imperial economic circuit. This intensified exploitation sometimes weighed heavily on the population, with demands for yields, taxes, military requisitions, etc. Nevertheless, Persian domination remained relatively short by 404. Before Christ, the Achaemenid authority wavered because the Persian Empire faced internal problems and wars against the Greeks. The Egyptians took advantage of this to temporarily free themselves. During this period of about 60 years, several local dynasties succeeded each other, trying to re-establish a purely Egyptian reign. The Yixti-Jaxim-Batmetith dynasty, with Amyrtaeus in 404 before Christ, took power by presenting itself as the champion of the revolt against the Persians. However, this dynasty remained ephemeral. It was followed by the Vatimid-Neoth and then the XXXth dynasty, whose representatives, for example, Nepherites the Firstmirs, then Teos and Nectanebo Firstner, struggled to consolidate the country's borders. Nectanebo Firstner and his successor Nectanebo II developed ambitious construction and temple restoration projects, encouraging a form of Egyptian cultural renaissance. They raised armies, strengthened fortifications in the Delta, and sought alliances in Greece. Unfortunately for them, the Persian Empire recovered under the leadership of Artaxerxes III, determined to reconquer Egypt. In 343, before Christ, the Persians returned in force. Lower Egypt was quickly subdued, and Nectanebo II had to flee south, disappearing from the political scene. This defeat marked the end of the native Egyptian dynasties. The Persians re-established their domination by taking more repressive measures against the elites. Some accounts, upheld by later historians, describe destruction of temples or pillaging, although the veracity of these sources is often debated. Nevertheless, this second period of Persian control weighed heavily on the political climate. Egypt seemed definitively under the control of a foreign power. The last years of Persian presence in Egypt occurred under the reigns of Artaxerxes III, Artaxerxes IV, and then Darius III. It was the terminal phase of the Achaemenid Empire, already threatened by the rise of the Kingdom of Macedonia, first led by Philip II, then by his son, Alexander the Great. The latter embarked in 334 before Christ on the conquest of Asia, winning victory after victory against the Persian armies. When Alexander reached Egypt in 332 before Christ, the Persian garrison surrendered almost without fighting, with the local population having no desire to defend their oppressors. Alexander was thus perceived as a liberator by many Egyptians who hoped to escape Persian tyranny for good. Upon entering Egypt, Alexander visited Memphis and organized a ritual to present himself as pharaoh before the Egyptian priests. To strengthen his legitimacy, he went to the Siwa oasis in the present-day Libyan desert to consult the oracle of the god Amun. The accounts, both Greek and Egyptian, report that the oracle greeted him as son of Amun, symbolically confirming his divine sanction to rule. In doing so, Alexander killed two birds with one stone. He enhanced his prestige in the eyes of the Macedonians and Greeks who accompanied him while appearing to embody the new pharaoh, protector of Ma'at, in the eyes of the Egyptian population. Aware of the ideal geographical position of the Mediterranean coast, Alexander decided to found a city bearing his name, Alexandria, on a narrow strip of land between the sea and Lake Mareotis. Construction began around 331 before Christ. The city was designed to become a major port and a center of political influence. After setting the administration of Egypt, Alexander departed eastward to continue his conquest into Persia. He died in 323 before Christ in Babylon, leaving behind a vast empire but no direct heir capable of maintaining its unity. His main generals, known as the Diadochi, each contested a portion of this gigantic territory. Among these, Diadochi Ptolemy, son of Lagos, takes possession of Egypt. A shrewd strategist, he understands the economic and symbolic importance of the Nile Valley. He transports Alexander's body to Memphis, then to Alexandria, making the conqueror's remains a prestigious relic that reinforces his authority. In 305 before Christ, he proclaims himself king under the name Ptolemy Barstir Soter, meaning the savior in Greek. Thus begins the Lagid dynasty, a Greek dynasty that will rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries until the death of Cleopatra VII and the Roman annexation. The Ptolemies strive to reconcile Egyptian traditions with Hellenic culture. On one hand, they have themselves crowned in Memphis in the presence of Egyptian priests, wear pharaonic regalia, and pay homage to Amun, Osiris, Horus, and Isis. On the other, they introduce the Greek language as an administrative tool, settling Greeks, sometimes Macedonians, sometimes colonists from other cities, in the army, administration, and commerce. A bilingual aristocracy emerges, while the majority of the rural population remains attached to Demotic Egyptian and traditional customs. This duality is also reflected in religious constructions. Great temples, such as those of Horus at Edfu or Hathor at Dendera, are built in a style inspired by pharaonic architecture, but embellished with Greek elements. A cultural mixing occurs, even if Greek domination remains strongly hierarchical. Alexandria becomes the jewel of the Lagid kingdom. Under Ptolemy I and his successors, the city is endowed with impressive infrastructures: the port, the pharaohs, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the royal quarter, the Museion, a center of learning, hosting scholars, doctors, and philosophers, and the famous Library of Alexandria, which could have contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls. This effervescence attracts Greek scholars, astronomers, mathematicians, poets, and artists. The flourishing economy arises from the export of cereals, papyrus, glass, and the tax levied on goods in transit. However, far from Alexandria, the situation is less idyllic. Many Egyptian peasants resent the rule of Greek elites, who seize the best lands and impose heavy taxes. Local revolts sporadically break out, sometimes supported by traditional temples. The Ptolemies suppress these uprisings firmly. Despite these tensions, the Laggid dynasty endures thanks to its diplomatic skill and the maritime advantage provided by its fleet in the Mediterranean. Its territory occasionally extends to Cyprus, coastal Syria, or dependencies in the Aegean Sea. But over time, rivalry with neighboring Hellenistic kingdoms proves costly and weakens the Egyptian monarchy. Alexander's decision to build a new city on the western delta of the Nile significantly alters the trajectory of traditional Egyptian civilization. In a few decades, Alexandria surpasses ancient capitals like Memphis or Thebes, which were nonetheless invested with a great religious and historical role. The Ptolemaic pharaohs gradually abandoned sacred ceremonies in the millennia-old temples of the south in favor of court life in an environment closer to Hellenic norms. Traditional religious processions persist locally, but the axis of power definitively shifts towards the Mediterranean. The Greek kings of Egypt, while burying themselves in pharaonic fashion, live according to a Greco-Macedonian cultural model daily. The pharaonic civilization, as it had evolved for nearly 3 millennia, slowly dwindles in the rest of the country. While Egyptian culture and religion remain vibrant, they lose their political preeminence. Meanwhile, Greek sciences, philosophy, literature, and theater permeate the heart of the Nile Valley cities. Jewish, Phoenician, and Syrian communities also settle in this ethnic mosaic. Egypt becomes a cosmopolitan kingdom, where multiple identities coexist under the firm direction of a Greek elite. From the 2nd century before Christ onwards, the Ptolemies found themselves increasingly dependent on the emerging republican power Rome, which was extending its sphere of influence throughout the Mediterranean. The wars the Ptolemies waged against the Seleucids in Syria, as well as dynastic troubles, intra-family marriages, sibling rivalries for the throne, often prompted the Laggid rulers to seek Rome's help to stabilize the region. However, the Roman power did not refuse its support, provided they demanded financial or political compensations that weakened Egyptian sovereignty. Ptolemy Tautin. Auletes, for instance, the father of Cleopatra VII, made pacts with the Roman Senate to maintain his throne, spending large sums of money to bribe senators and garner support from influential generals. As a result, the Egyptian state's coffers were depleted. Roman control was looming. Cleopatra VII. Philopator was likely born in 69 before Christ. The daughter of Ptolemy Auletes, she succeeded him to the throne in 51 before Christ, initially jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy X, according to Ptolemaic custom. Barely 18 years old, Cleopatra had to navigate court intrigues and Greek factions eager to control power. She quickly understood that Egypt's future was largely being played out in Rome, where Julius Caesar was consolidating his authority after defeating Pompey in the Roman Civil War. In 48 before Christ, Pompey, on the run, was assassinated just before his arrival in Egypt on the orders of the young Ptolemy III's officers. Caesar then landed in Alexandria and, judging this murder contrary to his interests, got involved in Egypt's internal affairs. Cleopatra took advantage of Caesar's presence to oust her brother. After a famous episode, she had herself smuggled into the Roman general's quarters, wrapped in a carpet, to secure a private meeting. Smitten, Caesar supported the queen in her war against Ptolemy III, which resulted in his death in the Nile. Cleopatra then retained power, first alongside another brother Ptolemy XIV, and later alone, all while giving a child to Caesar, Caesarion. This episode established the legend of the learned and strategic queen, who charmed the greatest statesmen of her time. After Caesar's assassination in 44 before Christ, Cleopatra managed to maneuver between the various Roman protagonists. However, she chose to ally with Mark Antony, a leading figure of the Caesarian faction with whom she had 3 children. Her political calculus aimed to preserve Egypt's sovereignty, shielding it from full annexation by Rome. Mark Antony, on his part, sought to counter Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, in the struggle for supreme power. Egypt, rich in wheat and gold, was a major strategic asset. For a few years, Cleopatra and Mark Antony ruled together over the eastern Mediterranean, settling in Alexandria, and even launching campaigns against the Parthians. Many territories were granted to Cleopatra's children, signaling the projection of an expanded Greco-Egyptian dynasty. But Octavian, an astute politician, set up propaganda to discredit this queen of the East, and the Roman general, traitor to his homeland. Tensions culminated in 31 before Christ, during the naval battle of Actium off the coast of Greece. Cleopatra and Mark Antony's fleet was defeated. Octavian then pursued his enemies to Egypt. Facing Octavian's superior maritime and terrestrial forces, Alexandria was besieged. Believing himself abandoned by Cleopatra, Mark Antony committed suicide. Desperate, Cleopatra attempted a final negotiation, but without any hope. In a gesture that became legendary, she took her own life in 30 Thalard before Christ, reportedly by allowing herself to be bitten by an asp, a viper, though accounts differ on the exact circumstances of her suicide. This tragic scene, often romanticized by later Latin historians, symbolizes the definitive end of the pharaonic monarchy. Egypt, having seen rulers like Narmer, Khufu, Hatshepsut, Ramses II, and many other great sovereigns, was now integrated into the Roman Empire. When Cleopatra dies, Octavian takes the title of the uncontested master of Rome. Quickly, he annexes Egypt as a mere province of the empire, although it retains a very particular status. Octavian, who became Augustus in 27 before Christ, is indeed wary of Egypt's potential wealth and the possible covetousness of the Roman senators. He therefore administers it directly through an imperial prefecture, with the prefect of Egypt being appointed by the emperor, unlike the governors of provinces elected or appointed by the Senate. The alloy between the Roman system and the ancient Egyptian order results in a complete reconfiguration of the institutions. Within the Roman Empire, Egypt continues to supply significant surpluses of grain, primarily destined for the provisioning of Rome, and, later, Constantinople. Egyptian temples remain in operation, but Romanization and subsequently progressive Christianization reduced the ideological impact of the pharaonic cult. Roman emperors sometimes authorized the restoration or decoration of sanctuaries to please local populations. It even happens that some emperors are represented in pharaoh's attire on bas-reliefs in order to ensure symbolic continuity. However, this appearance remains more of a propaganda protocol than a real incarnation of the Ma'at. Egypt is no longer governed by a lineage hailing from the country. It is under the sway of a much larger Mediterranean empire. On the linguistic level, Greek, imposed by the Ptolemies as the administrative language, remains predominant in power and economic circles. Latin, the official language of Rome, is only imposed at the level of the imperial elite and legionary forces. The Egyptian population, for its part, continues to speak various forms of Egyptian, Demotic, then Coptic, but the use of hieroglyphs declines in most common practices. Temples, which transmitted the knowledge of sacred writing, gradually lose their role. From the 3rd century AD, Christianity spreads through the Nile Valley, leading to the closure of many ancient places of worship. By the 4th or 5th century AD, the reading of hieroglyphs falls into complete oblivion, and it will take until the deciphering of this writing by Jean-François Champollion in the 19th century for it to be reborn. Ancient Egypt has left an indelible mark on universal history. The cradle of major innovations, it revolutionized architecture with its pyramids, perfected writing with hieroglyphs, and laid the foundation for mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. Its influence spread far beyond the Nile, inspiring future civilizations. Even today, its legacy fascinates and continues to illuminate our understanding of the past and human genius.